The wind that night carried a sharp, almost mocking edge through the quiet streets of Cedar Ridge, Oregon. Autumn had settled in with a stubborn chill, ruffling the fallen leaves along cracked sidewalks, and the lamps along the curving streets flickered in protest against the dark. For most people, this was the kind of night to huddle inside, perhaps sip tea by the fireplace or simply curl up with a good book. But for Martin Hayes, it was the kind of night to tinker, to create, to prove something, though he wasn't exactly sure what yet. Martin had always been the quiet sort. Not shy exactly, but deliberate, careful, the kind of man who noticed the way light hit a wall in the late afternoon, the subtle smell of rain in dry leaves, the faint hum of electricity through an old house. People in Cedar Ridge had long since decided that Martin was peculiar. Not in a mean way, just in a way that invited curiosity, whispers, and more often than not, ridicule. He lived in a modest two-story house at the end of Hawthorne Lane, where the trees bent low over the roof like protective arms, or maybe, depending on the mood, accusatory fingers. The house had been in his family for decades, inherited from an uncle who'd been as eccentric as Martin was now rumored to be. The neighbors often commented on the peeling paint outside, the wild tangle of the garden, and now, the latest source of amusement, his obsession with painting the interior walls completely white. "You're turning your house into a hospital, Marty," old Mrs. Klein had said one Saturday morning while walking her dachshund past his yard. Her eyes squinted as though the sunlight reflecting off his pristine white walls might actually blind her. "You ever think of color? Some warmth? A little beige?" Martin had smiled politely, nodding. "I like light," he said simply, and that was the end of the conversation for him. For her, it had been a new topic of gossip. Inside, the house smelled of fresh paint and faintly of sawdust, from the repairs Martin had been making on old window frames. The living room, once a patchwork of cream and soft blues, now gleamed like a blank canvas, each wall reflecting the dim glow of the overcast evening. Martin set a small, handcrafted candle on the center table. Its wax was pale, almost translucent, and the wick had been carefully dipped multiple times in his own homemade mixture, the scent of beeswax and vanilla filling the room. He lit it, watching the flame dance. It wasn't a showy candle, no elaborate holders or colored glass, but there was something honest about it, something steady. He had spent weeks experimenting with the wax, the wick, even the temperature of the room, trying to understand how light and space interacted. And the white walls were more than a preference, they were his experiment. "White walls reflect light better," he muttered to himself, almost like a mantra. "Better for everything, candles, lamps, even morning sun." The street outside was silent now, the occasional rustle of a leaf the only interruption to the quiet hum of the heater. But beyond the walls of his own house, Cedar Ridge had already formed its verdict. People whispered over fences, exchanged knowing looks at the coffee shop. Martin was odd, wasted potential, living in a hospital. But inside, with the soft glow of the candle stretching across walls that seemed to breathe in their own light, he felt something that defied their judgment. Potential. Possibility. Control over something small but beautiful in a world that often felt chaotic. His phone buzzed on the side table, snapping him out of his thoughts. A text from his neighbor, Dan, popped up. "Still staring at those blank walls? Thought you'd be done pretending to be an interior designer by now. Lol." Martin frowned, typing back slowly, deliberately. "It's an experiment, not decoration." No response came. He didn't expect one. No one in the neighborhood really understood experiments unless they were flashy, public, or messy enough to draw attention. His was quiet, intimate, and slowly, in its own way, revolutionary to him. As he sat there, the flame flickered against the stark white walls, stretching shadows into shapes that seemed almost alive. He could see the way the light traveled farther, moved faster, lingered longer. He could feel it in his chest, a warmth that was not just physical but existential. The world outside might mock him, might paint him as strange, but here, in this cocoon of white, light, and wax, he was discovering something that belonged to him and no one else. A knock at the door startled him. Martin rose, smoothing his paint-streaked shirt, and opened it to find Jennifer, his neighbor from 3 houses down. She wasn't one of the mockers. She rarely engaged in neighborhood drama, always polite, always slightly mysterious in her calmness. Tonight, though, her brow was furrowed. "I saw the light," she said, stepping in without waiting for an invite. "Tian, through your window, it's different, warmer even from outside." Martin gestured for her to sit, his hands still slightly trembling from excitement he didn't entirely understand. "I didn't mean to spy," Jennifer added quickly. "I just noticed it's brighter, more alive than any lamp on the street." He nodded almost shyly. "That's what I'm trying to figure out," he said. "How light behaves with color, how walls can change it. And candles, I've been testing these candles for weeks, trying to get them to last longer, burn cleaner." Jennifer tilted her head, curious. "And does it?" He smiled, a quiet, satisfied smile. "I think so." He glanced back at the candle on the table. Its flame had grown steadier, stronger. "I want to see if it can last through the night, if the walls help, if it's all connected." She leaned forward, her eyes reflecting the pale light. "I have to admit it's kind of mesmerizing, and honestly a little inspiring." The moment felt fragile, like a bubble suspended in the still air. Outside, the world continued with its judgments, but inside, time seemed to stretch. The walls, the light, the candle, it all felt sacred. Hours passed. The candle burned steady, a defiance against darkness, against ridicule. Martin watched it, noting the way the flame didn't falter, how the white walls seemed to amplify its presence. For the first time in a long while, he felt a thrill of triumph, quiet but profound. The next morning, the sun rose over Cedar Ridge, soft and pale, spilling through the large front windows. Martin got up, rubbed the sleep from his eyes, and noticed the candle's wick still intact, its wax barely diminished. He couldn't help but smile. Outside, the neighbors would walk by, glancing at his stark white walls and shaking their heads, muttering about his eccentricities. But Martin knew something they didn't. Something small, almost invisible, but powerful. Light traveled differently here. It lingered. It lasted. And if they wanted to mock him for that, let them. He moved through the house, inspecting the walls, the candle, the way the early morning sun bounced and scattered across the living room. There was a quiet magic here, a rhythm to the way light and wax and space interacted, and for the first time he felt like he had discovered a secret that wasn't about winning approval or fitting in. It was about mastery, about patience, about understanding something so simple that most people never bothered to look. Later that day, Dan stopped by, uninvited as usual, and peered through the window. "You really did it," he muttered, more to himself than to Martin. "Your candle, it's still burning." Martin opened the door, hands in his pockets, paint stains on his fingers. "Yes, and it will keep going." Dan laughed, a mixture of disbelief and admiration. "Figures. You've got to be the only guy in Cedar Ridge who actually uses white paint for science." Martin just smiled. He didn't need to explain. The proof was there, dancing softly in the glow of wax and reflected light, stronger and steadier than anyone outside could imagine. And somewhere deep inside, a small, triumphant voice whispered, "Let them mock. I'll let the light do the talking." The street remained the same, the whispers didn't stop, and yet Martin's little world inside those white walls had begun to change everything, not just for him, but for anyone patient enough to notice. That night, as the candle burned quietly in the corner, Martin realized something profound. Sometimes the simplest things, the color of a wall, the flicker of a flame, could hold the kind of quiet revolution that no amount of mockery could ever extinguish. He stood by the window, watching shadows move across the street, thinking of the neighbors, the doubters, and the people who laughed without understanding. And for the first time, he didn't mind. Because tomorrow, and the day after, and the night after that, his candle would burn, and it would last. The following week, Cedar Ridge seemed to buzz with a peculiar mix of curiosity and quiet tension. Martin noticed it as he walked to the corner market, his steps deliberate, his coat buttoned tight against the October chill. It wasn't overt gossip, not exactly. People weren't stopping him in the street, glaring from across the lawn, or confronting him directly. Yet, but there was a subtle shift, a lingering glance from the barista when he ordered his usual black coffee. A pause in the conversation between neighbors mid-laugh, as if someone had mentioned him, and the faint, almost imperceptible hesitation in Dan's voice whenever he greeted Martin over the fence. It all felt like a storm forming, invisible but imminent. Inside the house, Martin's little experiment had begun to grow. Candles weren't just candles anymore. They were instruments, pieces of a puzzle he was only beginning to assemble. The white walls were no longer just paint. They were amplifiers, mirrors of light, guardians of the steady flame. Martin found himself waking earlier, staying up later, measuring, noting, adjusting. Every candle burned slightly differently. Every flicker whispered a new possibility. Every shadow on the wall seemed to hold a secret rhythm he was determined to understand. Jennifer had become a quiet partner in his obsession. She came over often, sometimes under the guise of casual conversation, other times openly fascinated. She had a careful, almost reverent way of moving through the house, touching the walls lightly, adjusting the wicks, suggesting subtle tweaks. Martin had grown to trust her instincts in ways he didn't quite understand himself. "You know," she said one evening, as the golden flame threw light across the living room, "people will never see this the way you do. They can mock the white walls, the long-burning candles, whatever. But the moment they understand what it does to a space, to your mind, it'll hit them." Martin nodded, though he felt a twinge of doubt. "It's not about them. It's not about proving anything. It's about seeing what's possible." Jennifer studied him for a moment, as though trying to see the flame inside him that mirrored the candle on the table. "Maybe, but don't you want them to notice? Just a little." He shook his head slowly. "Not really. If it matters, they'll notice themselves. If not, well, then it doesn't matter." Yet despite his words, Martin couldn't entirely ignore the undercurrent of the neighborhood's judgment. Every time he walked past Mrs. Klein or Dan, he felt the weight of their eyes, the subtle judgment he had grown accustomed to, sharpened now by curiosity. It was one thing to be mocked quietly. It was another to be observed, to feel the collective gaze of Cedar Ridge trying to decipher him, to dismiss him, to understand him. Then came the incident that would change everything. It was a Friday evening, the sky bruised with the promise of rain. Martin had left his latest batch of candles burning in the living room, testing a new wax blend he'd concocted over weeks. Jennifer was visiting, sitting cross-legged on the rug, notebook in hand, recording observations and measurements in her meticulous, almost scientific handwriting. Martin stepped into the hallway to fetch another container of wax from the kitchen when he heard it. A sharp cracking sound, like ice underfoot, followed by a muffled yelp. He dashed back to the living room, heart pounding. The candle flames flickered wildly, as though responding to his panic. But it wasn't the fire that had caused the noise. It was Dan. Dan had somehow gained access to the house. How, Martin didn't yet know, and had tripped over the corner of the rug, sprawling into the living room just as a new candle burst to life on the table. Wax splattered across the pristine white walls, leaving tiny, glistening dots in the warm light. "What the?" Dan sputtered, scrambling to his feet, his eyes wide with shock and embarrassment. Jennifer jumped up, placing a protective hand over Martin's arm. "Who let you in?" she demanded, voice sharp, cutting through the chaos. Dan swallowed, clearly flustered. I just wanted to see. I. "You wanted to mock us," Martin said quietly, his eyes locking onto Dan's. There was no anger in his voice, only an icy clarity. "You wanted to laugh at something you didn't understand, but now you've seen it, and you've ruined part of it." Dan looked down at the wax on the walls, shame coloring his face. "I didn't mean." "You didn't mean," Martin echoed, stepping forward. "That's the thing, isn't it? People rarely mean. They act out of habit, out of laziness, out of judgment, but actions speak louder than intentions, and right now your actions have consequences." For a long moment the room was silent except for the subtle crackle of the candles. Jennifer's eyes met Martin's, full of quiet admiration. Martin could feel the tension in the air, thick enough to touch. Then slowly he bent down and inspected the wax on the wall. It was minor, almost trivial to anyone else, but to him it was a symbol. Proof that light and patience could be disrupted by ignorance, by carelessness. And yet, he smiled. "It's okay," he said softly, almost to himself. "It's just wax. We'll clean it. We'll learn from it." Dan, still standing stiffly, looked confused. "You're not mad." Martin shook his head. "Mad won't help. Understanding will. Maybe now you'll see what it takes to create something steady, to let a candle burn, to respect the walls it illuminates. For the first time, Dan seemed to really look at him, not just at the walls or the candles. There was hesitation there, maybe even awe. I didn't know, I thought. Martin let it go. Some lessons were better learned quietly, through observation, through consequence. Now you know, he said. After Dan left, this time escorted firmly by Jennifer, the house settled back into its quiet rhythm. The candles burned, scent, steady and unwavering. The white walls reflected every flicker, every shimmer of light, every shadow with an almost sacred patience. And Martin realized something else, something deeper. It wasn't just about the light, the walls, or the candles. It was about resilience, about endurance, about creating a space where beauty and intention could survive intrusion, mockery, and misunderstanding. By the end of the week, the story of Martin's miracle candles had begun to spread, quietly at first, through whispers and half-understood glances, through those who had ventured close enough to notice the difference. People who had once mocked the white walls were now pausing, curiosity lacing their skepticism. Some didn't understand. Some refused to believe. But a few, just a few, sensed the change, the quiet triumph that flickered from Martin's living room like a pulse in the heart of Cedar Ridge. And Martin, he continued to experiment, to observe, to refine. Each candle, each reflection, each subtle ripple of light across white walls became a statement of persistence, of quiet rebellion against ignorance. And every evening, as the streetlights flickered to life outside, he felt a small, steady thrill, the proof that even in a world that mocked him, even when hands reached where they shouldn't, light could endure. By late November, Cedar Ridge had transformed in subtle but undeniable ways. The autumn leaves had surrendered to early frost, and a biting chill swept down the streets, carrying the sharp scent of wood smoke and wet earth. Inside his home, Martin moved like a man possessed. The white walls were no longer a mere experiment. They were his canvas, his laboratory, and his sanctuary all at once. Candles of varying sizes and blends burned across every room, their light reflecting off the pristine surfaces, stretching into corners and across ceilings with a clarity and intensity Martin had never imagined possible. But the calm that had settled over Martin's house was deceptive. The storm he'd felt brewing in the neighborhood weeks earlier was about to hit, in a way he hadn't anticipated. It started one evening with a note tucked under his front door. The handwriting was jagged, hurried, and unmistakably angry. "People are talking. Stop making a spectacle of yourself before it gets worse." Martin read it twice, then folded it neatly and placed it on the kitchen counter. No signature, no explanation, just a warning. He showed it to Jennifer that night. She frowned, sipping her tea. "Typical," she said finally. "They don't understand, so they threaten." Martin shook his head. "I've dealt with mockery, I can deal with whispers, but threats, that's new." Jennifer reached out, touching his hand lightly. "You don't have to face it alone. If it escalates, we'll figure it out together." He nodded, grateful, but something deep inside him stirred. The note didn't intimidate him. It lit a fire, a different one. A fire that reminded him why he'd started this experiment in the first place. To test endurance, to let light survive the darkness. 2 nights later, the first real confrontation came. Martin had left the house briefly to collect a few more supplies for his candle experiments. When he returned, the sight that greeted him stole the breath from his chest. The front yard had been vandalized. Bright, crude graffiti sprawled across the white exterior walls, mocking symbols, phrases, even a crude depiction of a candle with a jagged, drooping flame. The words "fool" and "waste" were scrawled in black spray paint, jagged and hateful. Martin froze, his heart hammering, then slowly walked forward, his boots crunching over frost-hardened grass. Jennifer appeared at his side, eyes wide in shock. "Oh my God," she whispered. Martin ran his fingers over the cold, uneven surface of the walls, tracing the jagged letters. Anger flared briefly, but it was tempered quickly by resolve. The walls had survived months of experimentation, of accidental wax spills, of testing and retesting. They would survive this too. He turned to Jennifer. "It's just paint, we'll clean it, then we'll make it stronger, brighter." But the neighborhood's judgment wasn't the only challenge now. The vandalism sparked rumors and escalating tension. A small group of neighbors, emboldened by the anonymous note, began to call Martin's home that white prison and left passive-aggressive gifts at his doorstep. Burned-out candles, coffee grounds, even stones tossed against his windows late at night. One evening, as he patched a crack in the living room wall, Dan showed up again. This time sober, sincere, almost unrecognizable from the mocking figure who had tripped over his rug weeks ago. "You've got people stirred up, Marty," Dan said quietly. "Some of them aren't just mocking anymore, they're pissed, might even get violent." Martin didn't flinch. "Let them be. The walls, the light, they'll survive. I'll survive." Dan shook his head. "You don't get it, T. His isn't just about light or walls anymore. It's about fear. People fear what they don't understand." Martin paused, considering. Fear. Yes, he understood fear. But he also understood something stronger, purpose. And the candles, flickering steadily across every white surface, were proof. That night the first real test came. A storm rolled in from the north, furious and unrelenting. Rain hammered the roof, wind howled down the chimneys, and branches snapped like bones against the house. Power flickered, then went out entirely. Outside, the streets were dark, the world washed in shadow. Inside, Martin moved from room to room, lighting every candle he could reach. One by one, they came alive, flames steady and unwavering. The white walls reflected the light, amplifying it, turning the darkness into a soft, golden glow. He worked alongside Jennifer, her hands steady despite the storm raging around them. Hours passed. The wind battered the windows. A branch crashed against the front door with a deafening thud. Martin's heart raced, adrenaline surging, but he didn't falter. Every candle he lit became a beacon, a defiance against both nature and human ignorance. And then the moment that would define everything, he saw it. Across the street in the shadows, figures moving. At first, he couldn't make out details. Then he recognized the silhouettes, a small group of neighbors carrying torches, their faces twisted with anger and suspicion. They had come to confront him, to intimidate him, perhaps to destroy what he had built. Jennifer grabbed his arm. "Martin, they're here." He nodded, taking a deep breath, steadying himself. "Then let them see." The front door opened, and the storm seemed to pause. The first neighbor stepped forward, torch raised, eyes wide. But the moment he crossed the threshold, the glow of the candles hit him. The white walls reflected the flames with such intensity that the entire room seemed to pulse with light. Shadows leapt and danced, walls shimmered, and every corner of the house glowed as if lit from within by some sacred fire. The neighbors froze, torches trembling in their hands. For the first time, they weren't mocking. They weren't angry, they were transfixed. Martin stepped forward, voice calm but commanding. "This is what patience looks like. This is what persistence looks like. This is what light looks like when it's allowed to survive." A quiet spread through the group, a hesitant awe. No one spoke. No one dared move. The storm outside raged on, but inside the world had shifted. Then slowly Dan stepped forward. I didn't understand before," he admitted. "I thought it was stupid, a waste, but it's amazing." Others followed, murmuring agreement, disbelief mixed with genuine admiration. The mockery, the judgment, the anonymous threats, they all seemed to dissolve in the glow of the candles and the reflection of light across the white walls. Martin felt a swell of emotion, a quiet triumph that went far beyond mere victory over ridicule. It was deeper, more profound. Proof that something carefully nurtured, patiently built, could withstand fear, anger, and ignorance. That light, real, tangible, beautiful light, could endure. Hours later, after the neighbors had left, all lingering on their faces, Martin and Jennifer sat together, the room warm and golden. The storm had passed. Outside, the world was quiet, reflective, and newly respectful in its own hesitant way. Martin gazed at the flickering flames across the walls, the shadows dancing with a rhythm only he seemed to understand. "We did it," he said softly. Jennifer smiled, eyes reflecting the candlelight. "You did it." And in that moment, Martin realized that the white walls and the candles were never about proving the neighbors wrong. They were about proving to himself that perseverance, patience, and vision could survive anything, even the fear and hostility of others. It was a lesson burned into his memory. steady as the flames that now filled his home, illuminating not just the walls but a part of him he had always quietly known. The part that could endure, that could create, that could shine even in the darkest storm. The house was silent now, save for the gentle hiss of wax melting in the candle holders. Outside, the wind carried away the last remnants of the storm, leaving only a quiet street bathed in moonlight. Inside, Martin's white walls glowed softly, proof that even when the world doubted, mocked, or threatened, some things, like patience, persistence, and light, were unstoppable. The days that followed were quiet, almost surreal. Cedar Ridge had shifted, subtly but irrevocably. The neighbors who had once whispered and mocked now glanced toward Martin's house with a mixture of awe and hesitation. Some didn't understand what had changed, they just felt it. And others, more curious, ventured closer, asking tentative questions about the candles, the walls, the method behind the seemingly simple experiment. And that had captured the town's attention. Martin moved through his home with a calm he had never known before. The white walls reflected the morning sun in a way that made the house feel alive, almost breathing. Candles of every size, shape, and blend flickered on every surface, casting a soft, warm glow even in daylight. He walked from room to room, observing, making notes, adjusting wicks, blending waxes. It had become a rhythm, a quiet meditation that no one, not even Jennifer, fully interrupted. Jennifer came over one late afternoon, her notebook in hand, though she no longer used it to record scientific observations. Instead, she sketched, capturing the way the light bounced across the walls, the interplay of shadow and glow, the almost tangible atmosphere that Martin had created. "You know," she said, setting the notebook down, "people still talk. But it's different now, there's respect in it. They can't mock what they don't understand, not really." Martin smiled, glancing around the living room. The candles burned steadily, undisturbed by drafts, by careless hands, or by the chaos of the outside world. "It doesn't matter what they think," he said. "What matters is that it works, that it survives, that it teaches something, about patience, about focus, about perseverance." Jennifer studied him for a long moment, then reached out to place a hand over his. "And it teaches them too," she said softly, "even if they don't admit it yet." It was true. Word had spread quietly but insistently. People came by, first out of curiosity, then out of genuine fascination. They would step inside, eyes wide, and leave slowly, talking in hushed tones, careful not to disturb the delicate light. Some even returned with their own questions, tips, and ideas. Martin found himself teaching, explaining, demonstrating, though never condescendingly. His white walls and steadfast candles had become a symbol, a subtle lesson in resilience and quiet brilliance. One evening, after the house had been filled with the soft, golden glow of dozens of candles, Martin stood by the front window, looking out over the street. The neighbors' homes glimmered faintly under the last light of dusk, but his house stood apart, a beacon of light in more ways than one. Dan approached cautiously from across the street, carrying a small, awkward gift, a single, carefully made candle. He extended it toward Martin, eyes filled with a mixture of humility and admiration. "I wanted to, I see now," Dan said, voice almost breaking. "I didn't get it before, I mocked you, and I shouldn't have. You've shown me something I'll never forget." Martin took the candle, studying it for a moment before nodding. "It's about light," he said simply. "Not just the kind you see, but the kind you let grow inside yourself. That's what matters." Dan's shoulders relaxed, and he nodded slowly, finally understanding. The mockery, the fear, the ignorance, they hadn't destroyed Martin. They had only amplified what he had created, something steady, unyielding, and beautiful. Winter began to settle over Cedar Ridge, the first snow dusting the rooftops in delicate layers. Inside, Martin's house glowed like a sanctuary, every candle burning longer and brighter than ever before. The white walls reflected each flame, magnifying it, stretching it into the corners, filling the rooms with a warmth that was both physical and emotional. Jennifer sat beside him one evening, her fingers brushing lightly against the edge of the table where a candle flickered. "You've done more than just survive," she said softly. "You've changed things. Not just this house, not just these walls, but the way people see perseverance, dedication, and beauty. You've taught them without even trying." Martin looked around the living room, at the dancing shadows and soft glow, at the careful, deliberate patterns of wax and light he had nurtured over weeks, months, years. He felt a swell of pride and relief, not because he had proven anyone wrong, but because he had proven something to himself. That patience, care, and quiet dedication could illuminate even the darkest corners and endure even the harshest storms. And then he noticed it, a small detail he hadn't expected. In the center of the living room, one of the original candles he had lit months ago was still burning, long after all the others had diminished. Its flame was steady, unwavering, almost miraculous. He knelt beside it, feeling the heat and light radiate gently, and realized that this was the culmination of everything he had learned. That light, when nurtured with care, could outlast doubt, mockery, fear, and even time itself. Jennifer leaned over his shoulder, watching the candle burn. "It's beautiful," she whispered. Martin smiled quietly. "It's not just beautiful," he said. "It's proof that patience matters, that persistence matters, that quiet dedication can change everything, sometimes in ways you can't even imagine." Outside, Cedar Ridge was settling into winter. Snowflakes drifted down gently, covering the street in white. Inside, Martin's house glowed warmly, a testament to his journey, his resilience, and the power of light, both literal and metaphorical. And somewhere deep within him, Martin knew that the lesson of the white walls and long-burning candles would endure far longer than any fleeting gossip, any casual mockery. It was more than an experiment, more than a house or a neighborhood. It was a statement about the world itself. That light, when nurtured with care, could withstand anything. The neighbors would talk, of course. They always would. But now there was respect in their whispers, curiosity in their glances, and a quiet awe that Martin had never expected. He had turned mockery into admiration, skepticism into wonder, doubt into proof. And as he sat back, watching the gentle flicker of candlelight reflected across his walls, Martin realized something simple, undeniable, and profoundly satisfying. He had built more than a home. He had built a sanctuary, a place where light could endure, a place where hope, patience, and brilliance would burn long after fear and ridicule had faded into darkness. For Martin, the experiment had always been about more than just candles or walls. It had been about life itself, the way we face mockery, the way we persevere, and the quiet victories that often go unseen by the world. And in that golden glow, surrounded by the steady warmth of his creation, he finally understood the truth he had been chasing all along. Some things, nurtured with care and patience, are unstoppable. His neighbors might have mocked him once, and they might have doubted him. But in the light of his house, in the unwavering glow of his candles against the white walls, Martin had proven something that could never be taken away. He smiled, settled into his favorite chair, and let the warmth of the room and the quiet triumph of months of patient work wash over him. For the first time in a long while, he felt completely at peace. The candles flickered, the walls glowed, and Martin knew with every fiber of his being that he had endured and that his light would last.